I came back after 10 years cut off from the very people who once called themselves family. They used to call me the unmarried burden, the disgrace of the Reids. What they didn't know was that I secretly saved their precious winery. And worse, I'm also the one orchestrating the deal that will bury it. I didn't come with revenge. I came with a ring. And a recording of my mother screaming, "You plan to live like a stray dog forever. If you think this is just another family drama, you're wrong. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next." This story began at what was supposed to be a reunion wine party, but turned out to be the night every mask began to fall. Tokyo smelled like quiet rain that morning. Not the stormy kind, but the sort that creeps in sideways through narrow alleys and glassy train windows. Inside a tucked-away cafe in Shibuya, half Paris, half Code, Aria Reid sat alone by the window cradling a mug that had long gone cold. The letter sat unopened on the table. No return address, just her name written in a familiar hand, angular, rushed, but trying to look calm. She stared at it for a full minute before touching it like it might explode or apologize. She tore the envelope open slowly. Not for drama, but because everything from her family always arrived like a threat wrapped in nostalgia. "Dear Aria," it began. She didn't need to read further. The words weren't what mattered. It was the signature at the bottom, Connor, her younger brother, the golden boy of the Reid family. The last time they spoke, he told her over voicemail that maybe it was better if she didn't show up again until she figured out who the hell she was. Apparently 10 years was long enough. A family reconciliation dinner, it said. A chance to reconnect, hosted at the Vineyard estate in Oregon. The same one where her father once told her without blinking that she'd embarrass the family name if she ever brought her lifestyle to the table. Aria folded the letter quietly and tucked it into her coat pocket. Her reflection in the cafe window blinked back at her chin, sharper now, eyes more guarded. Tokyo had changed her. Or maybe Tokyo had just given her space to find the version of herself no one in Oregon ever wanted. Her phone buzzed once. A message preview lit up the screen. "Selene morning, mon amour. Flight time confirmed. Let me know when you're ready." She smiled. Not a romantic smile. A dangerous one, the kind that said, "I've waited for this." But before she could answer, it came. Uninvited and sharp as winter wind, the voice. Not out loud, but from the thickest part of memory, unkillable and cruel. "You think anyone's going to marry a girl who spends all day drawing monsters on a screen? That's not a job, Aria. That's fantasy." It was her mother's voice. Margaret Reid. Cut glass words spoken across the dining room table when Aria was 22, trembling with pride over her first video game prototype. The voice always returned when she least expected it, dressed in old perfume and religious shame. "You're not like your sister. Marilyn settled down, gave us twins. You give us arguments." That day, her mother had torn the sketchbook in half, told Aria to go outside and be normal for once. And when Aria came out 3 months later in the same dining room, her father looked away. Her mother prayed louder. She had left the next morning. Tokyo was her sanctuary, her battlefield, her becoming. Aria reached into her handbag and pulled out a small velvet box. It was unmarked. No logo, no memory of a man's fingerprints. She opened it slowly, as if unsure it would still be there. Inside, a platinum ring with a sapphire glinted softly in the gray morning light. Not an engagement ring in the traditional sense. No marketing brochure had ever targeted someone like her. But this ring meant something else. Choice. Declaration. Defiance. Selene had given it to her 3 weeks ago in a hotel room in Lyon. No flash mob, no tears, just a quiet promise. "If you're ever ready to show them who you really are, I'll be standing next to you when you do." Aria stared at the ring. Her fingers didn't tremble. They hadn't in years. Outside, the street, blurred with motion, umbrellas moved like petals across the wet sidewalk. She closed the box, placed it gently back in her bag, and stood up. The barista behind the counter gave her a nod of recognition but said nothing. They'd seen her here for years, typing at odd hours, sometimes with puffy eyes, sometimes humming low to music no one else heard. The quiet foreigner who rarely smiled unless she was talking about something no one else understood, like enemy AI patterns or narrative arcs. She walked out without looking back. Some people only return to their roots to prove the roots weren't worthy of them. The taxi was already waiting. Inside, she didn't ask for music. The driver didn't offer small talk. Aria watched the buildings slide past like faded memories. The rain hadn't stopped, but it no longer touched her. At the airport, Selene was waiting, tall, composed, wrapped in a dark wool coat that made her look like a figure pulled from a noir film. She smiled when she saw Aria. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. Aria handed her the letter. Selene read it quickly, then tucked it into her own coat without comment. "I'm not going back for closure," Aria said. "I'm going back for clarity. There's a difference." Selene tilted her head. What kind of clarity? Aria's eyes were ice and fire all at once, the kind that looks your mother in the eye and doesn't flinch. They walked toward the gate without touching hands but in perfect step. Two silhouettes against the sterile light of departures. This wasn't nostalgia. This was strategy. This wasn't reconciliation. This was confrontation dressed in quiet. Aria Reid was going home. Not to be forgiven, to be undeniable. The flight into Oregon was smooth, but the air felt heavier the moment they descended. The kind of heaviness that clings to bone. Outside the plane window, vineyards rolled like green scars across the land trimmed with surgical precision. The Reid estate hadn't changed. But Aria had. Customs, private gate, black car waiting on the tarmac. The driver didn't speak. He'd been instructed not to. Selene sat beside her in the back seat, reading a contract on her tablet glasses, low on her nose, an image of composed power. The two of them said little. They didn't have to. The drive from the airport to the family estate felt both endless and far too short. Aria stared out at the passing fields, familiar markers igniting memories she'd buried under a decade of silence. That rusted road sign, that fruit stand, that bend in the road where her father once said, "We don't stop for strangers," or for shame. The car slowed. And there it was. The Reid Vineyard estate sitting on its hill like an aging monarch, still proud, still pretending its kingdom hadn't started rotting beneath it. Red ivy climbed the stone walls. White chairs were being arranged in neat lines on the lawn. Someone was lighting the outdoor fire pit. The event wasn't just a dinner. It was a performance of unity, of forgiveness, of family. And Aria was about to burn the script. The car pulled up to the gravel loop. A dozen heads turned unprepared for the elegance of the vehicle. The Reid family expected Uber sedans. They got blacked-out German silence. Selene stepped out first. The moment her heels touched the gravel, the atmosphere shifted. She wasn't showy, but she was unmistakable. Black, wide-legged trousers, white silk blouse hair swept back like she'd come from court. She stood tall, took in the scene like a battlefield. Then came Aria. She wore deep, navy-structured, minimal sharp. No frills, no smile. Her hair was pinned in a way that said, "I dare you to look away." She stood beside Selene, not behind. Equal. The hum of the party faltered. People whispered, "That's her, isn't it? Is that Aria who's the woman with her?" Marilyn saw them first. She was by the patio table, flanked by three women in pastel dresses, laughing too loud at nothing. She stopped mid-sentence when she saw Aria. Her face froze. Then a smile slid across like oil on water. "Well, well," Marilyn said as she approached, voice soft but razor-edged. "Look who found her way back to the vineyard." Her husband lingered awkwardly a few feet behind, pretending to check the grill. "Hello, Marilyn," Aria said evenly. "You didn't RSVP. I wasn't sure the invitation was real." Marilyn laughed lightly, too practiced. "Of course it was. Everyone's welcome at a reconciliation." Her eyes flicked to Selene. "And who's your friend?" Before Aria could answer, Marilyn leaned in slightly, dropping her voice. "Let me guess. Here to perform again. One more statement piece for your autobiography." Aria didn't blink. "This isn't a performance," she said, voice steady. "It's the truth. And you'll want to remember it." Selene's gaze didn't flinch either. She reached for Aria's hand lightly, deliberately. Not a clutch, a tether. Marilyn's mouth tightened. Her perfect teeth pressed together in an almost smile. "You haven't changed," she said. Aria tilted her head. "I did. That's why I came back." Other relatives were circling now, drawn by the energy. Margaret Reid, Aria's mother, stood near the fountain, her eyes narrowing behind vintage sunglasses. She hadn't walked over, not yet, but her judgment had already arrived. An aunt waved politely. An uncle cleared his throat. The staff kept working, pretending not to watch. Connor finally emerged from inside the house. He wore a blazer too formal for the occasion, nerves visible under the collar. He spotted Aria, smiled hesitantly, then took a few quick steps toward her. "Hey," he said, quieter than expected. "Connor," Aria replied. "Nice venue." He looked around, forced a chuckle. "It's all for the family. Trying to make things right." Aria raised an eyebrow. "Right," she said. "Like the voicemail you left when I came out." He winced. "I was younger, stupid." "Still true," she said. "But thanks for the invite." Selene didn't speak, but her presence was unmistakable. When Connor glanced at her, Aria stepped in. "This is Selene Laurent. She's with me." Connor nodded awkwardly. "Of course. Welcome." He meant it, but it sounded like a question. Selene smiled, cool, professional. "Pleasure." People were gathering now, drinks in hand, waiting for Aria to explain herself. No one said it aloud, but the air was thick with expectation. This was the girl who had vanished. The disappointment. The rebel. The rumored millionaire. The one who chose Tokyo over tradition. The one who sent no birthday cards. The one who said no and never came back. Until now. Aria didn't offer them a speech. She let the discomfort bloom. Let the silence do what words could not. And when Marilyn leaned in again, half whispering with that polished venom only siblings could perfect, "You still think walking in with a woman is enough to make you matter here?" Aria answered without raising her voice. "No. But walking in as the only person not pretending that does." She walked past Marilyn into the garden, Selene at her side. And for the first time since arriving, she breathed. Not deeply, not freely, but deliberately. And that was enough for now. The Reid vineyard always knew how to dress itself up. By twilight, the estate shimmered and strings of warm lights twisted around the pergolas. Classical jazz floated from hidden speakers, and waiters in black-pressed shirts offered delicate plates of truffle canapes and miniature quiches. Everyone wore linen and practiced smiles except Aria. She stood near the edge of the courtyard, her hand grazing the rim of her wine glass. She wasn't drinking, just holding it the way one holds an excuse not to speak. Selene stood beside her like a shadow with purpose, calm, composed, a fortress in human form. The crowd moved around them like they were scenery. "Aria, dear!" a voice shrieked from behind her. It was Aunt Clarice, wrapped in floral silk and pearls that clicked like judgment when she moved. "I almost didn't recognize you. You filled out, but in a good way, of course." Aria smiled politely, the kind of smile people in Tokyo taught her, sharp, restrained, unreadable. "And this is your companion?" Clarice asked, dragging the last word like it was sticky. "Selene," Aria replied, "my fiancée." Clarice blinked. Then, as if someone flipped a switch behind her eyes, she gave a high-pitched laugh. "Oh, how continental of you!" she exclaimed. "Well, you always were the colorful one." Selene extended a hand, unfazed. "It's a pleasure." Clarice shook it briefly like she was touching an electric fence. I suppose the important thing is that you're happy. At your age, she added, sipping her wine too quickly and drifting off with forced elegance. That went well, Selene murmured. She didn't call security, Aria replied. That's improvement. But it didn't stop there. Across the lawn under the giant oak tree where Aria once scraped her knees as a child, the whispers grew thicker. Beneath the glint of wine glasses and practiced toasts, people leaned into each other with sideways glances. She lives in Tokyo now, right? I heard she makes games, like for teenagers. Didn't she used to be normal? It was always like this polished cruelty under the varnish of celebration. The Reid family didn't scream. They sliced. Aria drifted past the fountain, the one her father built after winning some civic award for business excellence, a relic of old pride. There, seated like a monument to legacy, was Nana Evelyn, Aria's paternal grandmother. Still alive, still sharp, still terrifying. Come closer, Evelyn said, waving a bony hand. Aria obeyed because no one defied Evelyn. The old woman squinted at Selene, French. Yes, Selene replied simply. Evelyn gave a small nod, then turned her stare to Aria. You look well fed. Nice to see you too, Aria said. Evelyn didn't smile, so she said no husband, no children. Just a French accent and a refusal to conform. Is this what passes for success now? Aria's pulse didn't rise. She'd spent too many years being emotionally outnumbered to let this woman win again. I've published 3 best-selling games, Aria said. I own property on 2 continents. I lead a team of 80 developers. And I sleep well. Evelyn sniffed. But no children. No children, Aria confirmed. No men. No need. Evelyn waved a hand dismissively, like swatting away dust. You'll regret it. One day when no one comes home to you. Aria stepped back, nodded, and said, You're right. That's why I stopped going home here. She turned and walked away, Selene falling into stride beside her. Neither looked back. At the drinks table, a waiter poured another glass of Merlot for a cousin too young to understand and too curious to ignore. The waiter in his 20s glanced toward Aria and Selene, then leaned toward the cousin. You know who that is? He whispered. The one in Navy? The cousin shook her head. She's the one paying our salaries this month. The cousin blinked. You mean? The waiter nodded. Anonymous investor. That's what the estate manager said. And just like that, it started. The rumors didn't come in waves. They crept like smoke. By the grilled lamb, someone murmured, You don't think she's the one behind that buyout offer, do you? By the dessert table, someone else said, Why do you think Connor invited her back after 10 years? By the fire pit, didn't he take out a loan last year? I heard it was covered anonymously. Like a fault line shifting underground, something in the party's foundation cracked. Not visibly. Not loudly, but definitely. Margaret Reid noticed it first. From the patio, holding a glass of Chardonnay, her eyes narrowed as she watched the quiet storm her daughter was causing just by existing. She set the glass down a little too hard. Selene and Aria found a quiet bench beneath a string of garden lights. It was their first moment away from the gazes, the smiles, the poison disguised as politeness. You okay? Selene asked. I forgot how good they are at pretending, Aria said. Like they rehearse it. They probably do, Selene replied. But tonight you're not here to perform for them. Aria nodded slowly. Her eyes wandered across the crowd, her bloodline, her history, her former prison. No, she said, I'm here to watch the masks slip. And they would. One by one. She would make sure of it. The door to her father's study clicked shut behind her. It smelled like cedar and arrogance, same leather-bound books, same heavy desk, same whiskey decanter that had never been refilled with anything less than pride. Aria stood by the window, arms crossed, her silhouette cutting through the afternoon light like a blade. Connor was already pacing. His blazer was off, sleeves rolled, collar loosened like he was halfway between apology and panic. He looked older than she remembered, hair thinning at the temples, lines biting deeper into the corners of his mouth. You know why I asked you here, he began, voice low. Aria said nothing. Connor ran a hand through his hair. 5 years ago. when the vineyard was drowning. We were 2 months from foreclosure. No one in the family knew, not even Dad. I'd been juggling bad deals, seasonal dips, cost overruns. He paused, searching her face for any flicker of recognition. You saved us. Aria didn't flinch. You, whoever you used to sign the paperwork, came in as a silent investor. Wired the money through 3 dummy corporations, bought the debt, kept the brand name. We were saved overnight. She still didn't speak. I didn't know it was you, he said. Not at first. Not until 2 years later when I recognized one of the names in the holding company. It was one of your old NPC characters. In that game you launched. Finally, Aria blinked. Do you want to thank you? She asked. Connor frowned. No, I want to know why. Why what? Why save us? Aria stepped toward the desk, fingers grazing the back of a leather chair. You were my brother, she said. Even when the rest of them made it clear I didn't belong, I thought, maybe you'd fight for me. I didn't, he said quietly. No, she replied, you didn't. Silence stretched between them, taut and vibrating. Connor broke it. There's something else, he said. The Reid Winery's at risk again. Aria leaned back slightly. Of course it is. Connor didn't laugh. A Japanese conglomerate Tsukino Group is in the final stages of acquiring us. They want to absorb the brand, repurpose the land for vertical agriculture experiments. They'll keep the name on paper, but it won't be ours. How poetic, she murmured. Connor stepped closer. They offered good money. But if the deal closes, the family loses all equity. Dad doesn't know. Mom doesn't care as long as the parties stay funded. Marilyn's husband pulled their shares last quarter. I'm the only one still fighting. Fighting for what Aria asked. A legacy that never made space for me. I know you're angry, Connor said, soft but urgent. But please, if there's any way you can help again, just... He stopped. Aria was reaching into her coat pocket. She pulled out her phone, unlocked it, opened her draft folder, found the email she had written 3 nights ago while Selene slept beside her in a Kyoto hotel suite, moonlight stretching over the tatami floor. The subject line read, Confirm acquisition. The body of the message was short, precise, ruthless. She hovered her thumb over the send button. Connor stared, color draining from his face. You knew, he whispered. I was the one who pitched, Tsukino, Aria said. I offered them the land. I architected the deal. Every dotted line, every clause. Why, he asked. His voice cracked like dry glass. Because I got tired of saving things that were designed to exclude me, she said. He sank into the chair behind the desk, visibly smaller now. You were going to sell us off without even saying a word. I gave you 5 years, she said. I gave you capital, silence, and dignity. You used all 3 and still managed to fail. This place is our home. This place is a wound that you kept open because you were too scared to admit it was infected. Connor's eyes were red now. Not from tears yet, but from realization. From the weight of what she'd become. He looked at her phone. Are you going to send it? He asked. Aria looked at the screen again. The message sat there. 1 click away from making the entire Reid estate nothing more than a bullet point in a Tokyo shareholder report. She let the silence grow long. Then wordlessly she moved her thumb to the trash icon. Deleted the draft. Connor exhaled. You're sparing us. No, she said. I'm postponing you. She turned toward the door. Why, he asked again. If you hate us that much. I don't hate you, Aria said without turning around. I just stopped trying to be loved by people who see me as an expense. She opened the door. Connor called after her. What are you going to do now? She paused, then glanced back over her shoulder. I'm gonna let you watch. Then she walked out, calm, composed, surgical. And behind her, Connor sat alone in the legacy he could no longer claim, staring at an empty inbox where salvation had just been erased. The long wooden dining table was set like a battleground dressed in silk. Crystal glasses, polished silver, white linen napkins folded into sharp triangles. At the head, a floral centerpiece sprawled in manicured chaos too perfect to be natural, just like the people seated around it. Margaret Reid raised her glass before the appetizer had even cooled. She wore cream, her signature color. It washed her out under the terrace lights, but lent her an illusion of grace. Her hair was pinned not a strand out of place. Her pearls sat heavy on her throat like a secret waiting to be weaponized. Aria felt the tension coming before a word was spoken. The pause, the clink of fork to plate, the clearing of a throat that meant the performance was about to begin. Margaret smiled, teeth tight behind wine. "Thank you all for coming." She began scanning the table like a politician scanning voters. "It means a great deal to have everyone gathered together again, as a family, even those who for a while forgot what family meant." A ripple of polite chuckles. Connor looked down. Marilyn didn't blink. Selene watched silently, arms loose at her sides, calculating every word like code waiting to break. Margaret raised her glass higher. "To unity," she said, "and to the strength it takes to stay and face your duties. Not to run, not to hide behind careers or foreign cities or philosophies." A beat. "Because we all know," Margaret added with a dry smile, "there's always one or two who prefer rebellion over responsibility." And there it was, the dart, polished and poisoned. The table froze for just a breath. Aria stood. Not fast, not angry, not theatrical. She rose with the calm precision of someone who'd spent years scripting this moment in her head. She didn't lift her glass, didn't smile, just looked her mother in the eye and said, "Not everyone who leaves is running." Margaret blinked, caught off guard by the quiet strength in her daughter's tone. "Some people leave," Aria continued, "because staying would mean dying a little more every day." You could hear a pin drop. Only the wind moved soft against the trellises, rustling the edge of the tablecloth, like it too was leaning in. Aria's voice didn't waver. "They leave to breathe, to grow, to remember what it feels like to exist outside a system built to shame them for being different." Someone cleared their throat. Someone else shifted in their chair. Margaret's fingers tightened around her glass stem. "We leave," Aria said finally, "because survival sometimes looks like rebellion to people who've never been suffocated." A breath, the kind that lands like thunder. Selene, still seated, reached up and placed her hand gently over Aria's. The gesture wasn't dramatic. It wasn't possessive. It was anchoring. Public. True. And in that moment, someone, an uncle, maybe a cousin's girlfriend, snapped a photo. The click was faint, but Aria heard it. So did Margaret. Her eyes darted briefly toward the sound, then back to Aria. "Well," she said softly, "that's quite the toast." "I wasn't toasting," Aria replied. "I was correcting the record." Selene's fingers didn't move. Across the table, Marilyn muttered something inaudible to her husband, then gave a small laugh, disbelief with a sour aftertaste. Connor opened his mouth to say something, anything, but stopped himself. For the first time that evening, Aria saw what she'd come for. Silence. Not the kind used to bury things, but the kind that follows after truth has detonated in a room and no one's sure how to breathe again. Selene rose beside her, and together they turned and walked away from the table. Not storming off, not running, just done. Behind them, Margaret's smile faltered. She reached for her wine again, but didn't sip. Back in the house, beneath the soft chandeliers and echoing marble, Selene stepped into the hallway and exhaled. "You didn't warn me you were bringing napalm?" she whispered. Aria half smiled. "You came dressed for fire." That night, the photo surfaced online. Aria Reid, world-renowned game designer, hand in hand with Selene Laurent, CEO of Laurent Ventures, at the Reid family estate in Oregon. The caption was vague, but the subtext wasn't. "The black sheep returns and burns the wool." By midnight, 3 entertainment blogs had picked it up. By morning, it would reach financial headlines. Aria stared at the image on her phone in the quiet of her old childhood bedroom, repurposed into guest quarters, stripped of posters, of books, of all the things that had made it hers. Only the window remained. And through it, the vineyard rolled on, unaware that its legacy had just shifted on an axis no one at that dinner table could comprehend. She closed the photo, placed her phone face down. Behind her, Selene said, "You did it." Aria didn't turn around. "No," she said. "I started." The headline dropped like a lit match. Aria Reid, game design icon revealed as silent owner in takeover of family winery. Subheadline: Sources confirm tech mogul's strategic ties to Japanese conglomerate behind Reid Winery acquisition. By morning, the article had spread from a niche industry blog to 3 major media outlets. Someone had done their homework cross-referencing shell companies' trademark transfers, even matching NPC names from Aria's earliest video game releases with legal documents buried under acquisition filings. They named her, they linked her, and they printed the photo. Selene's hand on hers, both women at the Reid family table. Aria's face turned just enough to reveal calm clarity and calculation. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It was business. It was betrayal. Inside the estate, the air was boiling. Margaret was already on her second glass of wine by 9:15 a.m. Marilyn had locked herself in the pantry to avoid saying something unforgivable. The family group chat was a war zone of passive-aggressive commentary and link sharing. But Connor didn't text. He stormed down the stone hallway toward the library, fists clenched, shoulders squared. His face was red mouth already half-formed into a question he didn't know how to end. Aria was seated calmly in a wingback chair when he found her, coffee in hand, legs crossed as if the room hadn't just been set ablaze by the world outside. "You knew this would happen," he snapped. She looked up. No greeting. "You orchestrated this," he growled, tossing his phone onto the coffee table. The headline stared up at them like a confession. Aria took a slow sip of her drink, unbothered. "And you're surprised?" Connor paced. The walls of the library, lined with dusty volumes on Grape's soil weather systems, felt suddenly like a coffin. "You gave the press just enough to destroy us." "No," Aria corrected. "I gave them the truth." "Bullshit," he snapped. "You leaked this. You timed it with the dinner. You wanted the optics." "You think I needed optics to make this real?" she asked, rising now, her voice low but lethal. "I could have ended your control of this place with a signature 6 months ago." "I waited, Connor. I gave you a chance to speak first." "And what you thought dinner was your redemption arc." "No," she said. "I thought it was your test." He stopped pacing. "They're pulling out," he said, voice falling lower. "Investors. 2 of our core buyers. You don't just reveal you're a silent partner in your own family's acquisition. You don't let it look like sabotage." Aria tilted her head. "What did it look like," she asked, "when your mother told the entire table that I ran away from responsibility?" Connor said nothing. "What did it look like when you stood beside her and said nothing? Still nothing. When she erased me in front of everyone with a toast dressed as a threat?" Aria stepped closer now. "Was that unity? Was that family PR?" "She's old," Connor muttered. "You know how she is." "Don't start with that," Aria said sharp. "We've excused her for decades. But you knew better." He looked away. "And you let me stand there," she continued, while she carved me up with a smile like it was sport. "You don't get to ask me about betrayal, Connor." He met her eyes again, this time not as a brother, but as a man realizing his rival had always been in the family photo, just cropped out. "You've changed," he said. "No," she replied. "I evolved." A long silence, the kind only blood relatives can endure. He sank into the opposite chair. "I don't even know what to ask you anymore," he admitted. Aria sat again too, folding her hands in her lap. "Ask me why I didn't send the final email," she said. "What?" She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and slid it across the table. A single draft email unsent. Time-stamped 3 days ago. Subject: Confirm immediate transfer of control. Reid Winery. Connor read it. Read it again. "You were going to push it through?" "Yes." "And you didn't?" "No." "Why?" "Because I thought maybe there was a version of this where you'd finally stop choosing silence." Connor set the phone down. "And now?" Aria leaned back, her voice softer now, but no less clear. "Now I wait. Not for apologies, not for their approval. I wait to see what happens when the Reid family finally realizes I was never trying to steal anything. I was just tired of earning my seat while everyone else inherited theirs." He swallowed hard. "They'll never accept you." "They don't have to," she said. "I accepted myself." He nodded slowly. "And if they try to push back to discredit you," Aria smiled. "I didn't build my empire in a vineyard, Connor. I built it in fire. Let them try." Outside, someone knocked tentative. It was a maid holding a copy of the Oregon Business Chronicle with Aria's face on the cover. Aria waved her in, took the magazine, and glanced at the tagline beneath the photo. "The black sheep who bought the farm." She tossed it onto the table like a final playing card. Connor stared at it, then at her. "They're going to come for you." Aria picked up her coffee, calm as ever. "Let them." The light in the old wine cellar was colder than she remembered. Aria stood at the threshold for a moment before stepping down the creaky wooden stairs. The scent of cork and mildew was still thick in the air, like time had refused to move on in here. Dust floated in the slivers of light that cut through the single narrow window above. The room hadn't changed, but she had. She ran her fingers across the sidewall smooth concrete stained from decades of storage. This was where they used to keep the reserve bottles, rare vintages, ceremonial labels. The pride of the Reid name, her father once said, like wine, could excuse every bruise silence ever left behind. In the corner behind two cracked crates was a rusted folding chair. She stared at it for a long while, then sat. The cold bit through her clothes, but she didn't move. The posture wasn't comfort, it was memory. A muscle twitch in her spine recalled the feeling of being 24 locked in here for 3 hours. No warning, no explanation, just a punishment for talking back. And what had she said? Just 5 words, "I'm not Marilyn, mother." The door had shut without ceremony. No yelling, no slaps. Just that chilling, calculated cruelty Margaret Reid specialized in: punishment without evidence, sentence without trial. She closed her eyes. And the memory opened like floodgates. It was spring. The windows were open. Aria had just come home from college with her first real portfolio prints of the video games she had been building in her dorm. Sketches, storyboards, demo builds. Her professor had called it commercially promising. A recruiter had offered to fast-track her into an internship at a studio in San Francisco. She laid it all out on the dining room table. "This is it," she told her mother, voice trembling with excitement. "This is what I've been working on. It's about a girl who builds an entire world after being told she's not allowed to exist in anyone else's." Margaret didn't respond. She simply picked up one of the pages. It showed a female warrior with pixelated scars holding a weapon made of broken clocks. "This," Margaret said. "This is what you've been doing instead of preparing for law school." "I never said I wanted law school," Aria said. "You didn't have to," Margaret snapped. "Your sister got into Cornell. Your sister had a plan." "I have a plan." "No, Aria, you have fantasies." Margaret gathered the pages into her arms like a pile of laundry. "Wait, Mom, don't!" But it was too late. The sound of paper tearing sliced through the air like a scream. One rip, then another, clean, deliberate. "Stop it!" Aria cried, reaching for the shreds. Margaret stepped back. "If you spent half as much time on your future as you do on these cartoons, you might have found someone worth marrying by now." Aria froze. "This," Margaret continued, holding up one last page before ripping it in half, "is why no one takes you seriously." And then the final blow, soft, almost whispered, "You're never going to make anything of yourself if you keep clinging to this virtual nonsense." The tears didn't come right away. Not when Margaret turned her back. Not when she walked upstairs, leaving Aria to gather pieces of her dream off the floor like broken teeth. Not even when the door to the wine cellar locked behind her later that night, after an argument about independence and disrespect. But they came now, years later, in the dark silence of that same cellar, older, colder, sharper. She didn't sob, didn't break. It was just a single tear running a perfect line down her cheek before disappearing into her collarbone. A mourning. Not for what happened, but for the girl who thought it was normal. A quiet shuffle came from above. She didn't move. Let them look for her. Let them wonder. Her phone buzzed on silent. A message from Selene. Where did you go? Aria didn't answer right away. She needed to sit with it, to let the echo finish, to remember fully. Because this wasn't just a trip home, it was an excavation, a reckoning, a declaration of emotional sovereignty. She stood, ran her palm once more across the wall, then whispered not to the room, not to the ghosts, but to herself. I didn't escape. I outgrew it. The door creaked open above. Selene stepped halfway down the stairs, a flashlight in hand, casting a soft glow across Aria's profile. I thought maybe they'd locked you in again, she said gently. Aria gave a dry smile. They'd need a stronger door. Selene extended her hand. Aria took it, and together they climbed out of the cellar, not running, not hiding, rising. They walked the perimeter of the vineyard as the sun dipped behind the pines, turning the rows of grapes into bronze ribbons. Aria hadn't spoken since leaving the cellar. Not a word. Selene didn't press. She simply walked beside her, quiet but unwavering like gravity. There was a rhythm to the silence shared, not empty. It wasn't until they reached the northeast edge of the property, where the vines gave way to wild grass and a disused maintenance shed, that Aria finally spoke. Why did you follow me down there? Selene looked sideways. Because I've seen you carry things alone. I didn't like how it looked on your face. Aria exhaled. Not quite a laugh, not quite sorrow. The silence settled again. Then Selene said it. He came to see me, you know. Aria stopped, turned. Who? Selene held her gaze. Connor. Aria's body didn't move, but something behind her eyes went very, very still. When she asked, 7 months ago in Paris, Aria's voice dropped. What did he want? To stop me, Selene said. From investing, from getting too close to anything with your name on it. The vineyard buzzed in the background, low insects, distant cicadas. Aria felt none of it, just the sound of her blood draining into quiet. What exactly did he say? Selene hesitated, not out of fear but caution. He said you were unpredictable, that you had a history of sabotage, that your motives were never long-term, that aligning with you would hurt my reputation. Aria blinked once. That's rich, she said, coming from someone who almost lost the estate twice. He didn't come to threaten, Selene said. He came to discredit, gently, intelligently, strategically. Of course he did, Aria murmured. That's the Reid way. We don't burn bridges, we pretend they were never built. She stepped away from the path out toward the clearing. They never saw me, she said. Not really. I was a tax write-off, a headline liability, a dinner table joke. Selene followed. You're not a joke to me. Aria turned back, her eyes glassy, not from tears, but from the slow realization that being unwanted was never the worst part. Being sabotaged from afar by blood was. All this time, Aria whispered, I thought distance had made them neutral. But they've been pulling strings behind my back, even when I gave them silence. Selene stepped forward. I didn't believe him. I know. I vetted everything she said. Your record, your companies, your IP. I watched interviews from 10 years ago, back when you still tried to smile through their absence. Aria's mouth tightened. And what did you find? Selene's voice was steady. I found a woman who kept building even after the blueprints were torn up in front of her. They stood in silence. A breeze rustled the vines again, louder this time, like something waking up. Aria tilted her head back, eyes scanning the estate. It looked peaceful, serene even. The illusion of harmony so practiced it bordered on performance art. But she'd lived the backstage version, the unfinished script, the canceled dress rehearsals. They had never rooted for her. They had rooted against her. Quietly, persistently. She thought of Connor sitting across from her in the library, trying to frame himself as the last reasonable man in a burning house. He didn't tell her he had tried to poison her name. He didn't even ask for forgiveness. He just asked for help. Cowardice in a tailored suit. Aria turned to Selene. It's time, she said. Selene nodded, not asking what for. I thought I could be surgical. Aria continued. Quiet, clean. Make my point without cutting too deep. She took a breath. But they don't deserve quiet. Selene said nothing, just stepped closer. What do you need me to do? She asked. Stand beside me, Aria said. Always. They began walking again back toward the main house. Every step forward was a quiet undoing of 10 years of silence. Every step was a seam splitting open. By the time they reached the veranda, the light had shifted. The mask of golden hour tranquility was gone. Only shadows remained. And for the first time in years, Aria was ready to be seen exactly as she was. Not soft, not sweet, not salvageable. But true, the parlor was full. Margaret had called for a family moment, the kind where no one had a choice but to attend. Crystal glasses lined the piano, and the scent of overcooked beef and resentment lingered in the corners of the room like a second wallpaper. Aria stood near the fireplace. She hadn't said much during dinner, and the silence had unsettled them more than a monologue ever could. She had smiled politely, passed dishes gracefully, but her eyes had stayed sharp, watching everyone too closely, like she was preparing to perform an autopsy, not a reunion. Connor leaned against the windowsill. Marilyn sat upright, clutching her wine like a weapon she couldn't figure out how to use. Selene stood just behind Aria, arms folded, gaze unwavering. Margaret circled slowly to the center of the room, drink in hand, taking her time like a queen surveying her court. She said nothing at first. Just looked at her daughter. Then if you brought us all in here to play victim again, Aria, you're wasting everyone's evening. Aria's face didn't move. Not a victim, she said softly. Just a mirror. Margaret rolled her eyes. You always did love dramatics. Aria reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small speaker. Black, square, cold. She placed it gently on the mantel. A few buttons lit up. Selene glanced at her, uncertain for the first time that evening. What is that? Margaret asked, tone tightening. Aria didn't answer. Instead, she pressed play. Static first, then a faint hum of background noise. Footsteps, a door closing, and then her mother's voice, sharper, younger, rawer. What the hell did you just say? Then her own voice, 24 years old, nervous, breaking. I said I'm not dating men. I never will. I'm in love with someone, a woman. A woman, Margaret repeated like tasting something spoiled. So you're what now? A lesbian. A pause. You think that's something to be proud of? People in the room stiffened. Aria didn't flinch. What is this, some rebellion phase? Something Tokyo taught you. What next? Blue hair, a shaved head, polyamory. A bitter laugh echoed from the speaker. Then the words that froze the air. Cái gì, con đồng tính à? Không cười ai à? Vậy con định sống như chó hoang cả đời sao? The words weren't even shouted. That's what made them worse. They were spoken like facts, like furniture, like weather. Marilyn paled. Connor straightened, stunned. Selene's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't blink. Just listened. The voice on the recording kept going. You want to ruin your life, fine. But don't drag us into it. Don't make this our shame to explain. You're a mistake I'm tired of defending. The room went still. The only sound now was the low crackle of the recording continuing to spin memories into confession. You will marry a man. You will fix this. Or you will leave and not come back. A click, then silence. Not from the speaker, from the room. Margaret stood frozen like someone had just poured ice down her spine. Her hand twitched around her glass, but she said nothing. Connor looked at the floor. Marilyn covered her mouth. Aria didn't say I told you so. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply stepped away from the fireplace, left the speaker where it was, let it keep playing silence. Then she walked toward the door. Selene reached out, but Aria touched her wrist gently, just a second of contact. A silent stay. Then she left, heel by heel across the marble floor. No one followed. Not right away. Inside the parlor, the family sat or stood in stunned stillness. The recording had ended, but the echo remained. Selene wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, the way someone does when they're not ready to admit what hit them hardest wasn't the words, but the fact that no one interrupted them back then. Margaret finally spoke. Her voice was thin, brittle. That was taken out of context. Connor looked up, stunned. Marilyn didn't move. It was recorded after an emotional day, Margaret added. She baited me. You know how Aria is. No one nodded. Selene turned, finally stepping forward. She didn't bait you, she said. She told you who she was, and you called her a dog. Margaret turned to her. You don't understand. No, Selene cut in. I understand perfectly. I understand what it does to a girl to be exiled while still standing in the room. Connor opened his mouth, closed it. Selene looked at them all. Every one of you let it happen. Then she walked out too. Left them with the sound of their own complicity. Down the hall, Aria stood at the bottom of the staircase, hand resting on the banister like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Selene came up behind her. Aria didn't turn. Do you regret it? Selene asked softly. No, Aria said. Even though it cracked the whole house. Aria exhaled. It was cracked before I got here. I just gave it light. Selene nodded. Then quietly, ready for part 2, Aria finally turned. Eyes sharp, steady. Now they've heard what they tried to forget, she said. She started up the stairs, one slow step at a time. At sunrise, she added, without looking back, they'll see what else I remembered. And with that, she disappeared into the second floor, leaving behind a room full of ghosts. And one still playing truth. The first sign was smell. Not the delicate scent of aged Pinot or overwatered roses, but something acrid, burnt, artificial wrong. Then came the shouts. Smoke, someone yelled from the back lawn. It's coming from the storage wing. People turned in unison like birds sensing a shift in weather. Within seconds, a low gray stream curled out from the left side of the vineyard, the old supply building adjacent to the bottling warehouse. For most of the guests, it was just a shadow on the edge of memory. To Aria, it was where she used to hide when the house got too loud. Now it was on fire. Panic surged fast. Chairs overturned, glass shattered, voices lifted into confused urgency. Margaret dropped her wine. Selene immediately stepped in front of her, shielding her from the stampede of guests already moving toward the driveway. But Aria didn't freeze. She was already moving. Down the stone path in 3 strides, pulling her phone from her coat, pressing emergency services with practiced speed. The dispatcher picked up. Calm female voice. Fire! Northern estate. Electrical likely. No visible spread to the vineyard yet. Guests evacuating now, Aria said. Address, the dispatcher asked. Reid Winery, 218 Grayson Hill Road, Willow County. She hung up without waiting for goodbye. Smoke was thicker now, curling up the west wall of the building, licking at the window frames like a living thing hungry for oxygen. Someone screamed. A child cried near the patio. The jazz music still played faintly in the background, surreal and sickening. Aria turned back toward the lawn. Everyone to the main drive, she shouted. Stay low. Don't run. Head to the gravel loop and stay clear of the south side. Most listened. Some didn't. But they followed her movement, her clarity, her lack of fear. Because in that moment, she was the only one acting like this wasn't a complete surprise. Connor appeared through the haze, frantic coughing suit jacket, half on. What the hell is going on? Electrical fire, Aria said. Old wiring. Probably the same you never updated when you took over operations. You think this is the time to lecture me? No, she said, this is the time to move. But he didn't. He looked past her toward the smoke and then back again, eyes narrowing. You did this. Aria blinked. What? You planned this. The timing, the chaos, the humiliation. Connor. First the press, then the audio. Now this, he shouted, voice hoarse. You lit the damn estate on fire to prove a point. You think I'd risk people's lives to make you feel small, she snapped. He didn't answer, and that was answer enough. Aria stepped forward, voice dropping to something sharper than anger. You're not terrified because the building is burning, she said. You're terrified because for once I didn't need fire to take the oxygen out of your world. I just needed to be better than you. He flinched like she had hit him. From behind them, flames cracked glass. A section of the upper trim gave way with a loud pop, sending embers into the grass. Selene appeared, guiding Margaret, ashen, shaking away from the chaos. Marilyn trailed behind, barefoot dress, stained with red wine and ash. You've ruined everything, Connor spat. Aria didn't break eye contact. No, she said. I revealed what was already broken. They stood there for another beat. Then came the sirens. 3 fire engines, red and urgent, tore up the gravel drive like hounds answering a whistle. Firefighters leapt from the trucks before they'd fully stopped coordinating, with precision deploying hoses assessing structural damage. One of them looked toward Aria. You the caller, she nodded. Good call. We caught it early. Wind could have taken it straight to the main house. She nodded again, then stepped aside as they moved past. Selene approached. Her hair was wind-tossed, jaw clenched. Everyone's out, she said. No one hurt. Aria looked at her. The archives. Selene shook her head. Gone. Burned through the corner wall. There was no time. Aria closed her eyes. There had been family history in that building. Documents, journals, wine records going back 3 generations. But strangely, she didn't feel the loss like she thought she would. Some legacies deserved to burn. From across the lawn, Connor still watched her like a man who'd just lost a war he didn't know had started years ago. The flames were dying now, but the silence that followed was even louder. He walked toward her again, slower this time. Not angry, just raw. You happy now, he said. This is what you wanted, isn't it? A spectacle. Your final scene. Aria didn't smile. Not everything I touch burns, Connor. Some things were already soaked in gasoline before I ever arrived. He stared at her. And you just brought the match. She met his gaze. No, she said. You did. The first time you told our parents I was too unstable to inherit anything. The first time you rewrote my name out of the will behind my back. The first time you convinced yourself I was dangerous just because I didn't need you. Selene stepped beside her, silent. And now Aria finished, you're just mad. The fire listened to me instead. Connor didn't respond. He just turned slowly and walked away through the smoke, disappearing, not like a villain, but like a man finally realizing the empire he built was made of dry leaves. And Aria, she stood still, watching the flames die, knowing this time the heat wasn't consuming her. It was clearing the way. By dusk, the smoke had thinned, leaving only a bruised scent in the air. The lawn was littered with damp tablecloths, broken glasses, and people pretending not to be shaken. Firefighters packed up their gear. Guests whispered like school children after a classroom outburst, half scandalized, half mesmerized. No one knew whether to leave or wait for the next aftershock. In the center of the patio, Margaret sat slumped in an iron chair, her lipstick smudged pearls uneven. Selene stood before her, clipboard in hand. I'd like to ask for everyone's attention, she said, not loudly, but with the kind of authority that silences a room. Heads turned, some sat straighter, others froze mid-step. Aria appeared at Selene's side, arms folded, face unreadable. Selene continued, I understand emotions are high, but I also believe that truth, when delayed, tends to rot, so let's disinfect it while it's fresh. She tapped the clipboard once deliberately. As of 3:14 this afternoon, the purchase of Reid Winery was finalized. All paperwork has been signed. Funds cleared. Transfer of ownership is complete. Silence. Then a ripple gasps disbelief, someone half choking on champagne. Connor, standing a few feet away with a soiled cuff and ashen collar, took one step forward. What the hell are you talking about? He asked, his voice cracked from smoke and ego. You sold, Selene replied. You just didn't read the fine print. Impossible. We agreed to delay negotiations. No, she said. You assumed we would. Margaret stood up too quickly, nearly losing her balance. You can't just take it, she snapped. This is our home. Correction, Selene said. It was your asset. You mortgaged it 6 years ago. You defaulted twice. We acquired the debt through a holding company you never thought to question. Marilyn muttered something under her breath and staggered toward the wine bar, finding only an empty bottle. Connor was pale now, shaking his head like it might reverse the tide. What are you going to do? He asked bitterly. Tear it down? Build condos? Let your girlfriend turn it into a Silicon Valley vineyard amusement park. Selene turned to Aria, and in a moment that felt almost choreographed, Aria stepped forward. No, Aria said calmly. We're going to build something beautiful. She scanned the faces surrounding them. Some angry, some confused. Some simply watching like spectators unsure if they were witnessing a collapse or a birth. We're renaming the estate, she said. It will no longer be Reid Winery. Connor opened his mouth again. Aria lifted a hand. It will be called Aria Cellars, she said. A center for winemaking. Yes, but also for immersive digital art tech residencies, experimental storytelling, and interactive history archives. She let the words sink in. I spent 10 years building worlds from scratch. I'm not interested in destroying this one. I'm interested in rewriting it. More silence. Then Selene added with a faint smile, and don't worry, the grapes stay. Connor stared at them both like they were speaking a language he refused to understand. You think this is redemption? He asked. You think this makes you a hero? Aria looked directly at him. I'm not a hero, she said. I'm a woman who was erased by her own blood and chose to make that absence valuable. She took a step toward the table where her mother still stood, eyes wide with disbelief and fury. You taught me legacy was earned through obedience. I'm showing you it can be forged through resilience. Marilyn spoke then low and venomous. You did all this to get back at us. Aria tilted her head slightly, almost amused. If I wanted revenge, you'd be watching this place bulldozed in the morning. She took a slow breath. But I didn't burn it. I bought it. I named it after myself. Not to shame you, but to remind myself I survived you. Her voice softened not out of pity but precision. I didn't come here to destroy the family. I came here to stop letting it destroy me. Selene placed the clipboard on the table. Copies of the new ownership agreement are available for those who are legally relevant, she said with finality. The rest of you may now choose to stay for dessert or go home to rewrite your opinions in private. No one moved. Aria turned her gaze across the vineyard, its soil now dark from water hoses, its leaves curling with heat. Then she said it, the line she'd been holding in her throat for over a decade. I'm not here for vengeance, she said. I'm here for rebirth. She turned her back on the stunned silence and walked toward the edge of the patio where the sky had started to bleed soft lavender. Behind her, no one followed. In front of her, the vineyard stretched long and open. She had just signed the deed to her past, and for the first time it was hers, not to inherit, but to reimagine. The moment the new name settled into the air, Aria Cellars, the weight of it came crashing down in ways no fire ever could. Margaret Reid staggered back a half step. Her glass slipped from her hand and shattered against the stone patio, but she didn't even flinch. Her knees gave before anyone could reach her. She collapsed into the wrought iron chair behind her, pale as the limestone walls around them. Selene instinctively moved toward her, but Aria lifted one hand. Not out of cruelty, out of clarity. Some things needed to be felt. This is ours, Margaret whispered, like the words might change anything. This is ours. This was meant to pass on. Aria didn't move. You passed it, she said calmly. Just not to the daughter you approved of. Marilyn's voice cut through the stillness like a broken violin. Chị chiếm hết mọi thứ chỉ để giận mặt sao? She snapped, trembling with fury. Sau ngắn ấy năm chị trở về lấy hết đội tên sỉ nhục cả gia đình trước mặt người ngoài, chỉ để thắng một cuộc chiến mà không ai còn đánh nữa. Aria turned face unreadable. Em nghĩ đây là chiến thắng à? She asked. Thử nghĩ lại đi. She took one deliberate step closer to Marilyn. You grew up in this house believing every lie they fed us, that I was broken, that you were the blueprint, that my dreams were distractions, and your milestones were divine. But let me ask you something. Her voice dropped almost gentle now. Did you ever once ask how I survived? Marilyn blinked, the question striking harder than any insult could have. Did you ever stop to wonder what it cost me to leave, to start over, to succeed with no last name behind me? No family dinners, no inheritance, no one to clap when I got it right. She stepped closer still. No, Aria said. You only ever asked why I wasn't like you. Marilyn opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The heat of the fire hadn't reached her. but the burn did. Margaret groaned softly from the chair, her breath shallow. She looked up at Aria, her voice barely audible. "I tried," she murmured. "I just wanted—" "You wanted control," Aria finished for her. "You called it structure. You called it love. But you never once loved me as I was, only as who you hoped I'd become." Connor stood behind them both, now unmoving. His arms were crossed, but his expression had changed. It was no longer defense, it was recognition, a slow, ugly understanding. Aria's tone never rose. "I spent 10 years building a life out of silence. Now I'm speaking in stone soil and ownership, and you call that revenge? No. This is justice in its quietest form." Marilyn finally found her voice. "You think changing a name undoes who we are?" "No," Aria said. "But it undoes who you thought I was." She turned then to the guests, the remaining family, the silent witnesses who had stood by when she was laughed at, talked over, ignored, erased. "You don't have to like it," Aria said. "But you will remember it. Every time you see that sign, every time you open a bottle, every time this place is spoken of in the world, you'll remember the daughter you didn't want built it better than you ever imagined." Selene stepped up beside her, said nothing. She didn't need to. Aria looked one last time at her mother, still stunned, hands limp in her lap. "You always told me I'd end up alone," she said. Not with bitterness, but clarity. "But I didn't. I ended up free." She turned to Marilyn, who stood frozen in a half-twist of pride and disbelief. "Don't worry," Aria added softly. "You'll still have your parties, just not your power." And with that, she walked past them all through the twilight across the patio that had once been her proving ground, her punishment, her prison. Now, it was just another part of what she owned. The paper was thick, embossed, weighted like consequence. Aria unfolded it with no ceremony, just clarity, and placed it neatly on the center patio table. A single sheet, but heavy enough to collapse the entire history that had held this place up for generations. "This," she said evenly, "is a formal 45-day notice of transition." Her voice was quiet, but echoed. Margaret sat rigid, unmoving. Her lipstick had faded completely now. Her eyes were red but dry. There was nothing left to cry. Connor stood behind her, fists tight, jaw locked. Aria looked at neither of them. "As of this afternoon, the Reid family no longer holds legal ownership of the estate. The deed is no longer in your name. You are now residing here as guests, and under new management that has a time limit." She slid the letter across the table until it landed in front of her mother. 45 days, she said. Plenty of time to pack legacy. No one spoke. Selene, dressed in black with a precision that felt almost surgical, stepped forward. In her hand was a second envelope. She didn't drop it like a bomb. She offered it like a choice. "I'm not without empathy," she said, voice calm, almost gracious. "This space is emotionally tied to your name. We understand the trauma of uprooting, especially when it comes unexpectedly." She placed the envelope beside the first. "That's why we're offering an alternative." Everyone looked at the second envelope like it might explode. "It's a lease agreement," Selene continued. "A short-term occupancy contract for your family to remain on the premises at a symbolic rent of $1 per year." The room held its breath. But Selene said it comes with a clause. She turned to Aria. Aria didn't hesitate. "It requires one thing," she said. "A written, signed public acknowledgement from the Reid family. An apology." Margaret's throat moved, but her mouth did not open. Connor inhaled sharply but said nothing. Marilyn shifted uncomfortably, arms folded so tightly they looked fused. "Not a press tour," Aria clarified. "Not a pity performance. Just truth. One paragraph, one sentence even. That you failed me, that you hurt me, that I survived anyway." Still no one moved. Not even a twitch. Aria waited. 10 seconds. 20. 30. Selene stepped back. "It's not coercion," she added softly. "It's restoration. You've been offered mercy, not punishment. What you do with that is entirely your legacy to write." Connor stared at the envelope. His fingers curled, then loosened, but he didn't reach for it. Aria looked around the circle of silence faces that once raised her, judged her, dismissed her. No one met her gaze. No one said they were sorry. Not a single word. And somehow, that was the most predictable part of all. I thought maybe she said at the end of all this someone would speak. Not because I need it, not anymore, but because it might show you were still capable of being human. She nodded once, not to anyone in particular, just to herself. "Thank you," she said, almost a whisper, "for proving me right." She reached forward, took the second envelope, the offer, and slid it back toward her side. Selene said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence was its own verdict now. Connor stepped forward finally. Aria turned her head slightly. He stopped. The words didn't come. Just a quiet exhale of everything he could have said if only it hadn't come too late. She turned away. The wind picked up slightly across the vineyard, sweeping through the vines like a tide of memory departing the shore. Aria began walking toward the estate gate, the stone path ahead, lit faintly by dying garden lights. Behind her, no one followed. Ahead of her, the land she now owned, named reimagined, unshackled from the myth of blood and inheritance. 45 days. They had time, not to stay, but to realize what they'd lost. The halls echoed differently at night. She carried no bag, no clipboard, no audience. Just herself, and the weight of all she'd already left behind. But Aria wasn't here to gloat. She wasn't here to check locks or marvel at her name staked on a deed. She was here to say goodbye. She stopped at the base of the attic stairs. For a long time, she just looked at them,